Well, please do take a seat. I've got Sermon Search prizes for Aniel, Matthew, and Shakabir. Aniel, Matthew, and Shakabir. And if you've got a Bible, if you can turn to page 61, page 61. If you haven't got a Bible, please put up your hand, and I'm sure one will be brought to you very soon. And in our series on the Ten Commandments, we've come to the fifth commandment, and we've come to Exodus in chapter 20 and verse 12, where we read this: "Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving to you." Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving to you. For me, nothing matters more than family. It's at the center of my life and at the heart of my politics. As a husband and a father, I know how incredibly lucky I am to have a wonderful wife and to have had 4 amazing children. Just to clarify, I'm reading a quote, just in case you're confused. But in loving my family and in reflecting on my own upbringing, I've also learned something important about the way that family and politics are inextricably linked. Long before you get to the welfare state, it is family that is there to care for you when you are sick or when you fall on tough times. It's family that brings up children, teaches values, passes on knowledge, instills in us all the responsibility to be good citizens and to live in harmony with others. And so for someone from my political viewpoint who believes in building a stronger society from the bottom up, there is no better place to start than with family. So reads part of the introduction given by the then Prime Minister David Cameron in a speech he gave in August 2014 at the Relationships Alliance Summit. And in reading that introduction, I'm not saying that I agree with everything that he says after that, far from it, but family. Now, one of the effects of looking at the 10 Commandments one by one is that it makes you realize how big and how important each one is, and none more so than this one, the fifth command, the command to honor your father and your mother. As society puts youth on a pedestal and views the elderly and the aged as a problem, as the latest statistics are published about crime amongst teens or the lack of care for the elderly, if there was ever a commandment that would radically transform society if it was taken seriously, they don't come much bigger than the fifth commandment, this command to honor your father and your mother. When Woody Allen interviewed Billy Graham back in 1969, he asked Billy Graham what his favorite commandment was out of the 10 Commandments. And Billy Graham, with 5 children and 3 grandchildren at the time, said that it was this one, the command to honor your father and mother. "Really?" Woody Allen replied. "That's my least favorite commandment." He said, "When I get older and earn enough money, I'm going to put my parents in a home." "That's very good," said Billy Graham, laughing, "and I hope that it's going to be in a home with you," much to the amusement of the audience. If you were allowed favorite commandments, which one of the 10 commandments would be your favorite? How high up on the list would be the fifth commandment, the command to honor your father and your mother? Now remember the context. God has rescued these people from Egypt. He saved them to be his people, and he's given himself to them as their God. He's promised to give them a land of their own, and he's just about to fulfill that promise. Very soon they're going to be an official nation with physical boundaries and borders. He's going to be their king, and here, he as their king is giving to them the laws which they as a community are to live by. And this fifth commandment is going to be one of those foundational laws by which their society is to function. Now, I understand that we live in a very broken and a very sad and in a very wicked world, where there are some parents who are far, far from what they should be. And if you have a parent or parents like that, I'm very sorry, And I understand that for you to think through the fifth commandment, it takes great care and sensitivity and wisdom. I also understand that there are some families who are single parent families. And you'll understand that because we've only got one talk on this commandment, you can't cover everything. And so we're just going to look at it all generally. And we're going to do it by asking 6 questions of verse 12. And the first question is, what is the command? What is the command? Well, very obviously, verse 12, the command is to honor your father and your mother. The command is to honor your father and your mother. Today, society honors film stars and sports stars and A-list celebrities, and it rolls out the red carpet for them. And yet here we find in this command that we are to roll out the red carpet for our parents. And not in a superficial or showbiz, idolatrous kind of way, but in giving them a special place in our hearts and lives and interaction. We are to honor our fathers and mothers. And I want you to notice that it's both your parents that you are to honor. So it's not that you're allowed to honor your father but disrespect your mother, nor is it that you're allowed to disrespect your father and honor your mother. It's a command to honor both. And when you travel through the book of Proverbs, you keep finding this again and again. So you keep reading these verses where in one line it will speak about the father, and then in the second line it will speak about the mother. Proverbs 6 and verse 20, for example, my son, keep your father's commandments and forsake not your mother's teaching. So this command here is a command to honor both of your parents, father and mother. Notice also in this command that the obligation to honor your parents is not based primarily on whether or not you think they've earned it. The obligation to honor your parents is not based primarily on whether or not you think they've earned it. Ephesians 6 and verse 4 and Colossians 3 and verse 21, they tell fathers, they tell parents to bring up their children and to parent their children and to raise their children in such a way that it will make their children want to honor them. So twice their parents are told not to provoke their children. One of the qualifications you find in 1 Timothy for being an elder is whether or not that father has managed his household well. And one of the signs that the father has managed his household well is that the children respect him and honor him. So there is this onus, there is this responsibility on the father, on the parents, for how they raise their children and bring up their children and relate to their children. And yet the obligation here to honor your parents is not based primarily on whether or not you think they've earned it. And that's because all parents fail in one way or another. All parents fail from one time or another. Excluding Jesus, no one is perfect, not even you. And I suspect that your parents have many regrets, or perhaps words they've said in the past, or reactions they've had, or the example they've been at different points in time. And so at the very basic level, there is a honor due simply because of the role that God has called them to. And I want to ask you this morning, are you keeping this commandment? Are you keeping the commandment to honor your father and your mother? Okay, second question. Who is to keep the command? Who is to keep the command? Leviticus 19 and verse 3 says, every one of you shall revere your mother and father. Every one of you shall revere your mother and father. That's fairly clear, isn't it? Every single one of us are to honor our father and mother. If I'd started by saying if all the children can put their hands up, I suspect that those who are younger might have put their hands up. But if I had asked the same question in a different way by asking if all those with parents can put their hands up, all of us would have had to have done it. You see, this command, it's for every single person here in this room, whether we are old or whether we are young. You remember the context of this command. This command wasn't originally given to a hall filled with Sunday school children. No, this command was given to the whole congregation of Israel. It was given to 5-year-olds and 10-year-olds and teenagers and 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds and 40-year-olds and 50-year-olds and 60-year-olds and 70-year-olds. Moses was 80. It was given to children and teenagers who still lived at home. It was given to young couples who had got married and had moved away from home. It was given to people whose parents were now elderly. It was given to older people whose parents had passed away and who only had memories left of them. And yet even they, in the way in which they remembered their parents, were still being called to keep this command to honor their father and mother. And I want you to imagine how transformed society would be today if society took this command seriously. The command to honor your father and your mother. Thirdly, why is this command important? Why is this command important? Well, the verse tells us to some extent, because it tells us how you respond to your parents will affect the enjoyment or the fullness of your life. That's something of what the second half of the verse is getting at. Parents are a gift given to us by the Lord. So as God is our Heavenly Father and He blesses us and He cares for us beyond description, so God, our Heavenly Father, He gives to us many fathers. He gives us earthly fathers, earthly parents, who are also a benefit and a blessing to us and who often are the channel that God uses to channel His blessings into our lives. Paul describes this command in Ephesians 6 as the first command with a promise attached to it. That as the people, as they look forward to being in the promised land, their enjoyment of life in the land was going to be much greater and much fuller and much better than if they honored their parents. And perhaps if you are younger, the principle's true still today. Now, those who honor and obey their parents, they usually stay safer and remain healthier, and they get into less trouble, and they usually live longer than those who don't. And it stands to reason, doesn't it? It's very obvious that the child or the teenager who's always rebelling against and disobeying his parent or his parents, disobeying parents who love them and who care for them, who generally know what's best for them, who have more experience than them, who are wiser than them, that rebellious teenager, they're going to run into trouble at one point or another. Why else is it important? Well, here is a question for you. Usually we divide up the Ten Commandments into vertical commands and horizontal commands. So vertical commands in that they show our responsibility primarily towards God, and then horizontal commands in that they show our responsibility primarily towards the people around us, towards our neighbors. And the question is, where does the fifth commandment fit in? Would you say that the fifth commandment is a vertical command, or would you say that it's a horizontal command? I think most people would include it amongst the horizontal ones, the ones that show our responsibility towards other people. That commands 1 to 4 are all about us loving God, and commands 5 to 10 are all about us loving our neighbor. And yet there was a line of Jewish thought that included it within our responsibilities primarily towards God. That as we honor our parents, we are honoring the God who has given to us our parents and put them in authority over us. So you find in Colossians 3, in that passage that we read, and in 1 Timothy 5, Paul says there that children who honor their parents please the Lord. And Paul is not just talking about young children. He is in that Colossian passage, but in the 1 Timothy 5 passage, he's talking about adult children. And so as we honor our parents, we please the Lord. When we please our parents, we are pleasing God himself. What an incentive to honor your parents. Now, whether or not you would include it amongst the vertical or the horizontal, it's certainly at least a bridging command from one to another. In fact, you could say that the fifth command is the foundation stone for all the commands that follow. That the commands 6 to 10, they're all built on the fifth command. That learning to honor your parents is the key to loving your neighbor. Because if someone doesn't honor their parents, the question is, well, who then are they going to honor? Now, the home is where children learn to live under someone else's authority, and they learn what respect is. And if they don't learn that at home, then where are they going to learn it? If they don't learn to respect their parents, who are they going to respect? That's why you get such severe penalties in the Old Testament for rebellious children. So you have an example in Deuteronomy 21, verses 18 to 21, where you have that stubborn and rebellious son. And he refuses to listen to and obey his parents. He refuses to respond to discipline. And he grows up to be a glutton and a drunkard. And what is to be done with this rebellious son? He's to be stoned to death. He's to be executed. If you turn over the page to Exodus in chapter 21 and verse 15, you find this. Whoever strikes his father or his mother shall be put to death. That's an incredibly severe punishment. Whoever strikes his father or mother shall be put to death. Now, it's important to understand that it's not talking about a young kid or a toddler or a young child. It's talking about a child who's got to the point where discipline is no longer effective and you just can't do anything with them. You see, anyone who is capable of violence towards their father or mother is capable of violence towards anyone. Augustine said this. He said, if anyone fails to honor his parents, who will he spare? Certainly not the person he hates in verse 13, or the husband whose wife he's attracted to in verse 14, or the person he's got it in for in verse 16, or the neighbor whose property he covets in verses 15 and 17. In the Old Testament, those who grew up not honoring their parents and rebelling against them, they were seen as a menace for society. They were seen as a threat for society. Because if they wouldn't honor their parents, who are they going to honor? And in the New Testament, though we live under the new covenant, the New Testament, where it sees a society that is characterized by disobedient children, Romans 1 verse 30, 2 Timothy 3 verse 2, it sees that society as being very far from the Lord. A society that is characterized by disobedient children is seen as a society that is far from the Lord. And so this command is serious because it's the key to loving your neighbor. It's the key to loving your neighbor. Fourthly, what does this command mean? What does this command mean? I've got 5 words for us, and the first is respect. The first is respect. The word honor is the word for glory, or for weightiness, or for heaviness. It's a weighty responsibility to be a parent, isn't it? And maybe if you're a young child or teenager, you probably don't realize what a weighty responsibility is to be a parent. And children, picking up on this weighty theme, they should give their parents a ton of respect. They should give their parents a ton of respect. Do you respect your parents? Whether you're young or you're old, do you really respect your parents? I like the fairy story of an old man who lived with his son and daughter-in-law. He'd obviously grown very weak with age, and so when he ate his food, his hands would often shake and he would miss his mouth. His daughter-in-law used to really resent him living with them. It interferes with my right to happiness, she would often tell her husband. And so one day, her and her husband, they gently led him away from the family meal table, and they led him to the corner of the room where he had to eat his food by himself without them being disturbed. One day while he was eating in the corner by himself, his hands were shaking so much that he knocked his plate onto the floor. The food went everywhere, all over the carpet, and the plate smashed. Snapping, the daughter-in-law said to him, she said, "Right, if you are a pig, you must eat like a pig." And so she began serving up his food in a pig's trough. One day, the daughter-in-law and the husband, they were watching their 4-year-old son play with bits of wood. "What are you making?" they asked interestedly. "I'm making a pig trough," he said, smiling for approval, "to feed Daddy and Mummy with when they're older." And without saying a word, they looked at each other. And the daughter-in-law, with tears in her eyes, went over to her father-in-law and led him back to the table. To honor our parents or our parents-in-law means to respect them and to treat them with respect. And I think, looking at society around us, this is as much as a challenge for adults as it is for young children. How do you think about your parents? How do you treat them? How do you talk to them? How do you talk about them? Respect. Second word is appreciation. Appreciation. This command is one of 2 commands that doesn't begin with a "you shall not." And that's partly, I think, because within the command there is a gift. There is a gift. And the gift here, of course, is our parents. Our parents are a gift to us from the Lord. God has given them to us, and we should appreciate them. And we should be so thankful for them. So thankful for the gift that God has given to us. So thankful for the person that they are. So thankful for all that they've done for us. I think about this even basically from a financial perspective. In 2015, The Telegraph ran an article saying that the average cost of raising a child in the UK is over £230,000. £230,000 that your parents have spent on you, invested in you, from the age that you were born or just before to the age of 21. I can't get my head around that figure. And yet, whether or not it's very accurate, it highlights the fact that our parents have sacrificed massively and they've invested hugely into us. And they've done it in ways that we can't even begin to measure. Think about it again, even just from a basic level. Think of all the meals they cooked for you. I think of all the hours they spent working in jobs to provide for you. Putting a roof over your head. The sacrifices they've made to give things to you when they've gone without. Decisions that they've taken to ensure the best for you. Jobs that they've done for you. Car journeys, being your taxi driver, taking you from place to place. A time they've spent with you. Holidays they've taken you on. Memories and experience they've shared with you. Different things that they've taught you. The example they've been to you. You see, part of honoring our parents is appreciating them and thanking God for them and being thankful to them and not taking them for granted. I remember a song released back in 1988 by Mike and the Mechanics, and it told the story about a son who had fallen out with his dad. It was called In the Living Years. And it tells the story of how this son left it too late to be reconciled to his father. And in it was this verse: "I wasn't there that morning when my father passed away. I didn't get to tell him all the things I had to say." And he goes on to describe all the things that he wished he'd told him in the living years. You see, God only gives to us our parents for a certain amount of time. And we are to appreciate them. I am to appreciate them for the gifts they are to us. Third word is listen. Listen. Wonder, do you listen to your parents? Do you listen to your parents? Proverbs 1 and verse 8, hear, my son, your father's instruction, and forsake not your mother's teaching. Proverbs 23 and verse 22, listen to your father who gave you life, and do not despise your mother when she is old. Of course, your parents won't always be right. And when you marry and you leave home, as Genesis 2 describes, and you leave your parents, or when you become an adult and you leave home, your parents will not be in authority over you in the way in which they once were, but they're still to be honored. And their words are still to have weight with you. If you are still living at home, do you honor your parents by listening to them? By giving weight to their words, their commands, their teaching, their advice? Fourth word linking in with this is obey. As we've just said, when a child leaves their parents through getting married or becoming an adult and leaving home, their parents no longer have the same role of authority over them, and parents and parent in-laws are not still to try and exert that level of authority in subtle ways or not so subtle ways. But for those who are still living at home, for those children, a big part, a massive part of honoring your parents is obedience. So Proverbs 6 verse 20, my son, keep your father's commandment and forsake not your mother's teaching. Ephesians 6 and verse 1, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Colossians 3 and verse 20, children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. That's fairly all-encompassing, isn't it? Obey your parents in everything. And there is nothing outside of that. So that includes when you're asked to tidy your room, or share with your brother or your sister, or put the knives and forks out on the table, or get ready for school, or do your homework, or get back at a certain time, or finish playing on your phone or your computer. In everything, remember all that they've done for you. Think about how much it really pleases the Lord when you obey them. Think about when you, God willing, will also be a parent one day, and what it will be like on the other side of the fence. Think especially about Jesus. Okay, if you're younger, maybe if you're a teenager and living at home, do you ever think like this? I know I used to. Do you ever think, my parents just don't understand? They don't get it. They're so old now. They don't understand the situation. Things have moved on now. Do you sometimes think you know more than your parents? You know, if there was ever a child who knew more than his parents, it was Jesus, wasn't it? And yet what do we find 12-year-old Jesus doing in Luke 2 and verse 51? We find him submitting to and obeying his parents. And then you have a fifth word, and it's the word care. It's the word care. In 1 Timothy 5 and verses 4 and 8, we find that children are to repay their parents and their grandparents. That as their parents cared for them when they were younger, so now their parents are older, they are to be caring for them. Now, this may look different in different situations, and yet again, imagine how transformed society would be if this command was taken seriously. The impact on the statistics of those living in old age, in poverty or in loneliness, or in care homes that aren't really caring for them. Maybe you're someone here who has elderly parents. Are you keeping the fifth commandment? Again, think about Jesus, this time on the cross, John 19, providing for his mother before he died, committing her into the care of the disciple John. Jesus kept the fifth commandment right up until the end of his life. Care. A fifth question, where do you draw the line? Where do you draw the line? And I'm not talking about care here. Where do you draw the line? And we've said that children are to obey their parents in everything, and yet, of course, that can't be completely true. Parents are not to take first place in our lives. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew 10, whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. In Acts 5, we're shown a principle that if it comes down to a choice between obeying God and obeying people, God must come first, even before parents. You see, the first commandment is the commandment to which all the other commands bow. So while treating our parents with respect, God must come first in our lives. And that must be thought through wisely and sensitively. And then the final question is this. What about prodigal children? What about prodigal children? And when you think about the severe penalties in the Old Testament for prodigal sons, it makes the parable that Jesus told about the prodigal son even more wonderful. About how his father, instead of stoning his son to death as the Old Testament required, instead he ran to him and he kissed him and he wrapped his arms around him and he put the family ring on his finger and shoes on his feet and the best robe around him, and he killed the fattened calf and he held this great big party, and there was music and there was dancing because his prodigal son had come back home. You know, spiritually speaking, we are all rebellious children. None of us have honored the God who made us. And the challenge may be for you this morning is have you gone to the Father of all mankind and asked for his forgiveness? Maybe you have been rebellious towards your earthly parents. Have you gone to them and said sorry? And earthly parents, as you have enjoyed the wonderful love and forgiveness and patience and kindness of your Father,